Our keynote speaker this afternoon is Vincent Larivière. Vincent Larivière est professeur de sciences de l'information à l'Université de Montréal, où il est également titulaire de la chaire de recherche du Canada sur les transformations de la communication savante et vice-recteur associé planification et communication stratégique. Il est également directeur scientifique de la plateforme de diffusion de revues savantes Réseau. Vincent Larivière is professor of information science at Université de Montréal, where he also holds the Canada Research Chair on Transformation in Scholarly Communication and is Associate Vice Rector, Strategic Planning and Communication. He is also the Scientific Director of the Scholarly Journal Distribution Platform, Réseau. Please welcome Vincent Larivière.
Merci beaucoup, Laurence. So I'm going to just share my screen. Okay, should have been able to do that faster. We now have a lot of experience doing that. So here it is. So thanks for the invitation. So I want to say a few words on the measurement of research impact. And how it can be applied to scientific platforms. So I'm going to start by just laying down the transformations that have happened in the research evaluation landscape over the couple of decades. Then I'm going to kind of give you guys a primer on bibliometrics, which is my area of specialty, which is one of the tools that can be used to measure the impact of scientific platforms. So we'll go through various bibliometric data sources and their limitations, and I will kind of try to debunk a couple of bibliometric myths about the things that it can do and the things that it cannot do. Then I will destroy a bit journal impact factor, which I hope you're not considering to evaluate your platforms. I'm going to move on to talk a bit about altmetrics, which provides I think, some interesting indicators of the online visibility of scholarly papers. Then I'll discuss a couple of other indicators that would allow to describe the effect of platforms. And then I'll move on to the specific challenges associated to the measurement of the impact of scientific platforms, which I hope is going to kind of lay a basis for a discussion with you guys about what I see as avenues for you. So research evaluation. So of course, traditionally, peer review is the gold standard, be it for the evaluation of projects and researchers, as well as for the evaluation of the outputs of these projects. So basically, peer review is everywhere in the academic system, from publication to grant to positions to tenure. It's kind of, again, of the gold standard. But we know that peer review is far from being perfect. And one of the main limitations is that it actually has an optimal size. So if you want to assess individuals or small group, peer review works actually pretty well. But if you want to assess research conducted at McGill University or research conducted in Canada, well, you need quite a big group of peers. So it's kind of not feasible to perform peer review at a large scale at a macro level. So for that, we need macro level indicators. We need something that allows to assess the ecosystem rather than the sum of the individuals. So that's kind of a very big limitation of peer review, for which I believe we have solutions with bibliometric or scientometric measures. Of course, the second limitation of peer review, which you are all aware as researchers, is that of course it's subjective. Reviewer 1 and reviewer 2 don't necessarily agree about what is good research. Again, peer review is subjective, and given that it's a social process, well, it is subject to the, let's say, limitation of such processes. And the third point is that, of course, peer review is kind of costly. I would say that bibliometrics and scientometrics can also have a cost, but peer review at a large scale with funders, etc., as an important cost. So given especially the first limitation, many countries are increasingly using bibliometric indicators to understand the ecosystem. So it's part of the data that has been compiled, and in many cases since basically the end of the Second World War, it's kind of the macro level data that is used to organize science. So it's data that is used for science policy. Of course, there are a lot of country and institutional variations. So in Canada, bibliometric indicators are used at the macro level to understand patterns. In China, it's the basis of individual researchers' research evaluation. So basically, in order to get tenure or professorships in China, you need to show strong bibliometric indicators. So they have actually gone, they're not using peer review anymore. It's mostly indicator based with a lot of adverse effects. So I'll get back to that later around the conclusion. But I would argue that in Canada, we are actually having the right balance between peer review and bibliometric indicators. There's actually very few institutions that are using bibliometrics to evaluate researchers individually. It's something that is useful, again, to assess things at a macro level. So when we're talking about bibliometrics, we're actually talking about the use of the published literature, of the documents that are authored by researchers to measure scientific activity and to measure scientific impact. So in most fields, the only tangible output of research are actually these scholarly papers. Of course, in technological fields, you may have some other artifacts, but in general, it's going to be scholarly papers. And by actually measuring some of the facets of those papers, some of the information that they contain, we're actually able to measure science. We're able to measure the knowledge that is being produced. And of course, the data on paper that we're using are papers that are peer-reviewed, which again, we talked about the limitations of peer review earlier, but this is what we're measuring. There are increasingly databases that index preprints also, so we're able to also measure what's being, let's say, science as it's happening rather than science as it has been done a year ago, given the time that it takes for peer reviewing. But all of those documents, irrespective of the stage in which they are, can be measured, and they actually provide very useful information on the world of research. So in order to perform these bibliometric analysis, we need databases. And historically, there was only one database, which was called the Science Citation Index. Some of you may be familiar with that name. It's now part of a database that's called the Web of Science. But basically, this database had the monopoly for about 30 years. It's the company that provides the journal impact factor, which you may be aware of. The first key thing with this database, as well as the others that have been created afterwards, is that none of them is actually exhaustive. There's no database that will measure each and every paper that researchers have written. The key question is, do they provide a representative sample of the research that is being conducted? The answer to that actually varies by field. So for most of the medical fields, for most of the natural sciences, using either the Web of Science or Scopus will provide you actually most of the papers that your research community will have written. They have biases, but these biases are not so much a problem for those fields. And the two main biases basically of Web of Science and Scopus is that they mostly index or almost exclusively index papers in English and exclusively, let's say, index papers in the international-ish type of journals. So that works well for medical sciences and natural sciences. It works much less well for social sciences and humanities, where languages other than English are still very present. And also many documents are published in national journals as well as in books. So the two standards, and this is what you will come across when it's going to be time for you to let's say, assess your platforms, is that Web of Science and Scopus are the standards. And I would argue that those work well. There's also newcomers in the database ecosystem, one of them being Dimensions, which, contrary to Web of Science and Scopus, Dimensions is a non-restrictive database. So it tries to index everything. So it starts with Crossref, which is the organization that provides papers with their small digital object identifier, which means that it indexes, at least for last year, about 6 million papers. While for Web of Science and Scopus, it was around 3 million papers. So Dimensions actually comes closer to indexing pretty much everything. The only issue, though, is that the database misses a lot of metadata. So for some of these papers, institutions may not appear, funding acknowledgements may not be there. So there remain some problems with those data. A couple of words on Google Scholar, which I'm sure every one of you are aware of. Google Scholar is a great tool for information retrieval. It's a great tool to find papers. It is much less useful for bibliometric analysis, especially at the institutions or country or funder or platform level, because you can only look at data for individual researchers. So researchers can have their profiles. You can retrieve the data for these profiles, but it's much more difficult to get macro level data at the level that would be of interest to you guys. So your sweet spot for the platforms remain the two gold standards, which I mentioned previously, that is the Web of Science and Scopus. Dimensions may become useful at some point, but I would argue that we are not there yet. That being said, despite these different platforms, the results that you would obtain with any of them is actually highly correlated. So there's not a universe of science indexed by the Web of Science and some other universe indexed by dimensions. These databases have a lot of overlap, very high correlation. So basically they are more or less, they can be replaced by one another. So couple of limitations. I'll go a bit quick on that because I mentioned it already. So there's issues of data quality, and this may become important at some point for the platforms themselves. Of course, these databases index what appears on papers. So if the information is not on the paper, they will not invent it. But even if they copy what's on the paper, sometimes there's going to be mistakes. Sometimes list of affiliated institutions will not be there. The Web of Science does a better job at harmonizing and cleaning their data. Google Scholar does none of that. And Scopus is also relatively good. So you kind of have a hierarchy of data quality there, with the Web of Science kind of being the cleanest database and Google Scholar being the one that would be the most messy and for which you would need to do a lot of manual work to perform your analysis. The second limitation, which I believe is relevant for platform, is the fact that they have a poor coverage of conference proceedings. This is something that may not be so important in the health sciences, but the more and more your community will create platforms in computer science and engineering, well, that's going to be a big missing part because those fields actually publish a lot of conference proceedings. In those fields, actually, it is worth the same thing as scholarly papers. There's many conferences in computer science that have a 5% acceptance rate, which is very similar to journals like Science, PNAS, and The Lancet. So just as a summary of those things, again, there's inequalities in what we can measure. If it's in medical sciences and it's in English-speaking communities, it works pretty well. If it's in non-English communities, and that's the case in Canada, we do have a couple of those, the coverage may be a bit less good. And of course, social sciences and humanities in non-English-speaking communities is where we have a lot of blind spot. But I believe that most of the fields that you cover fall into the good to excellent coverage on the top right quadrant. So, in order to measure impact using bibliometric methods, of course, the key or the standard indicator is citation. So by citations, we're basically meaning the number of times a given paper will be used by other papers, basically as a building block to create new knowledge. It's been a standard for, I would say, about 40 years. It does have limitations, and we need to be careful with those indicators. And so my goal here is to try kind of to both debunk a couple of myths and also show you what is the right way of compiling such indicators. The first thing about citation indicators is that they vary a lot across disciplines and specialties. So the probability of a paper in, let's say, cancer research to be cited is much, much, much higher than a paper in anatomy or a paper in cell biology. So the dynamics of citations are really community driven. They're basically a function of the length of the references list in those fields, as well as the speed at which citations accumulate. So when we want to compile such data, we need to perform some kind of field normalization. Otherwise, we will compare apple with oranges. So let's say that you would like to compare a platform again in anatomy and a platform in cancer research, and you would just use raw citations. You would find that the cancer platform has a much higher impact. But of course, that would be driven directly by the field in which it is, rather than by the intrinsic quality of the research performed by the platform. So first, field normalization is crucial. Otherwise, we are comparing apple with oranges. The second thing is that it takes time for citations to accumulate. So on the moment the paper is published, of course, it has not accumulated any citation. So you need to be a bit patient. The good news is that in your field, things go relatively fast. So after a citation window of 2 to 3 years, you actually have a good idea of the long-term impact of a given research piece. In the social sciences and humanities, it can take 10 to 15 to 20 years. But in medical sciences, it's actually quite fast. So the length of the window varies by field and specialty, which means that when we perform field normalization, we need to control for both field as well as year to be able to, again, compare apples with apples. Citation indicators do not have a perfect correlation with peer review. It has one, we may call that a moderate correlation with peer review, for the simple reason that it's actually two different things. So peer review is basically assessing what is the perception of the quality of the research, while citation indicates in a way the usage of a given piece of research by other researchers. And it's fine that those are two different things, and I'll get back to that later, but it suggests that we, in an ideal world, we should be able to use both because they give us basically two different viewpoints on the impact globally of an infrastructure or a piece of research. From a technical point of view, citations exhibit a skewed distribution. So in any set of papers, you would see that a couple of papers are highly cited and that most papers are actually lowly cited. So when we compile such indicators, we need to be aware that quite often they are driven by a few outliers which are highly cited. It is not a problem in itself in the sense that we do need these highly cited papers. We know that research can be of unequal quality, and what we want to do as a platform or as a funder is to create some of these star papers once in a while, but we need to understand that this distribution is skewed. Not all papers don't follow a normal distribution in their citation rates. There's two myths that we hear often about citation, which is self-citations and uncited. So there's a perception that self-citations are driving a lot of citation rate, that most researchers or many researchers are citing themselves too much. It's actually not really true. So, and here I want you to focus on the blue curve first, which is actually the proportion of researchers self-references. So this is based on an analysis that we're currently performing based on about 35 million researchers at the world level. So it's really large scale, really robust. And what it shows, unsurprisingly, is that at the beginning of one's career, they don't cite themselves a lot because they don't have any past papers to cite. So the more you age, the more you're going to cite your previous work. Why? Well, because researchers' trajectory are relatively linear. You don't change topics every week. So you build upon the previous work that you've been doing. And therefore, the more you age, the more you are likely, just from a pure probabilistic point of view, to cite your previous papers. And at age 30, so basically career age 30, it reaches about 10%, which remains, I would say, relatively low in terms of a proportion of self-references. So self-references and self-citation, what this suggests is that it's actually not that important, and it's kind of a normal feature of researchers' career. And most of the impact that researchers get is not from their own citations. It's actually from citations given by other researchers. So it's not a big limitation of citation analysis. The second myth that we hear often is that, well, most research is not really useful, most research is not cited, and that's actually not true either. So what you have here is the proportion of cited paper as a function of time since publication, and of course, on the year they are published, as I mentioned earlier, most papers are not cited. It takes time for citations to accumulate. But as you can see, in most fields, it goes very quickly. And the vast majority of papers are used by other colleagues. And that actually also excludes self-citation. So again, papers are cited mostly by other colleagues. And I don't have data on that because I cannot put data on everything, but we do have it in our lab. So most citations are actually not negative. Most citations are actually positive or neutral. So of course there are negative citations, but it's a very, very, very tiny proportion of all of the citations that papers are received. And keep in mind that the concept of impact is relatively neutral. And if your paper is highly cited, but negatively, well, it's because it had an impact on the field in some way. But again, these cases of papers being highly cited, but in a negative manner are very, very rare in the scholarly literature. So citation indicators at the paper level are relatively useful. There's also a lot of researchers, and I would say unfortunately, that rely on the impact factor to measure scholarly impact. And I would argue that this is not a great practice, especially given that we have individual paper citation rates. So there's no value added to use the journal level indicator when you actually have the paper level indicator. So the impact factor is a very simple indicator that provides the average citation rate of papers published in a given journal. It's an indicator that was created for librarians to choose journals to which to subscribe to. And when the journals became digitized and that libraries started to subscribe to pretty much everything, the usage of the journal impact factor kind of shifted to from collection development to basically evaluating researchers and their papers. And I mentioned China earlier. They are probably the country that makes the most important use of journal impact factor. In some universities in China, it is the basis of salary bonuses that can go as high as $165,000. So if you publish a paper in Nature, Science, or PNAS in some of those universities, you get directly in your account, for you, not the research account, but in your own salary, a bonus of $165,000, which is quite crazy from my point of view. So there's a lot of issues with the journal impact factor. Well, as you can see, it's something that researchers talk about a lot. There's kind of an exponential growth until a couple of years ago of papers that talk about the impact factor, that where journal showcase their impact factor. They're happy about it, they discuss it, etc. But it has a lot of problems. The first problem, and this is a bit technical, but I'll try to be clear and quick. There's a mistake in the calculation of the impact factor. So basically, in the numerator of the indicator, you have citations that are, you have actually all of the citations that are received by the journal. And in the denominator, it's only divided by articles and reviews. So basically, journals that publish a lot of editorials, that publish a lot of letters to the editor, kind of get bonus citations, because citations to those documents are counted in the numerator, but those documents are not in the denominator. So when we see the effect of that for journals such as Science and Nature, we see that, well, it actually increases their journal impact factor by, well, 20 to 25%, because again, they publish a lot of front material. So it's a mistake that the Web of Science is very aware of, but they have not been correcting it for decades. And it does lead to an uneven ranking of journals where all of those multidisciplinary journals are favored by the calculation. Of course, when you compile a symmetric impact factor, it doesn't become a bad journal. It stays on the top, but still it changes the rank of the journal, and it favors some journals to the expense of many others. So from a technical point of view, it's a calculation mistake. Quickly on that, the disciplinary variations are actually quite huge. So this is just for a set of discipline, the mean impact factor and the maximum impact factor of journals in that category. So in clinical medicine, it can go to around 200 in terms of the journal impact factor value. Well, if you're in math, the max is 10. So again, that shows that measuring impact needs to be done within a discipline. Otherwise, we are comparing apples with oranges. This is a crucial point which speaks to the skewness that I mentioned earlier. So within a journal, citations do not follow a normal distribution. So there's most of the papers in any of those 4 journals, which as you can see have totally different impact factors from 30 to 15 to 10 to about 5. In all of these 4 journals, most papers are actually in the low cited end. So they're on the left of the distribution. Why does Cell have a journal impact factor of 30? Well, it's because it has around 25 papers that were cited more than 100 times. So given that the journal impact factor is based on an average, it's highly affected by outliers. But if we are to pick up a paper randomly in any of those 4 journals, we would probably find a lowly cited paper or a paper that is mostly on the left side of the curve. So that's a problem mostly because many people take the impact factor value of the journal and attribute it to the paper. And this is where the fallacy happens. You have the individual data for that paper, you can have its citation rate, but instead of doing that, you're taking the group measure, which is the impact factor. And this is something that it's not a limitation of the impact factor itself, it's a limitation, the use that the community is doing of the journal impact factor. This is what is sometimes done in some committees in Ottawa or at other funders, and this is something that we should not be doing. This is something that that does disservice from my point of view to science. And linked to that, the journal impact factor actually is less and less a good predictor of the impact of individual papers for a very simple reason that most researchers nowadays don't read journals. They read paper individually. So since the advent of electronic journal, there has been kind of a disjunction between journal issues and individual papers. So historically, researchers would have their 5 or 10 journals that they would read cover to cover. And those, of course, would have been chosen with the impact factor. And in the end, well, the correlation between the GIF of the journal and the citation rates of the paper was actually much higher. It has never been that high, but it was a bit higher. Since researchers nowadays read paper, they use Google Scholar or PubMed to find their papers, irrespective of the journals in which they are published. Well, basically the correlation decreases. And at the level of journal, we see that the elite journals, the most cited journals, actually decrease in their importance in the ecosystem. So a journal like PNAS, for instance, used to publish around 9% of the top cited paper in the world level. Well, it's now at about 3%. Nature is decreasing, Science is decreasing. All of those journals are decreasing in their market share of the most cited papers. So my point here is that we have citation data at the paper level. There is no point in using the journal level indicator. It can only lead to unfair comparisons. Now moving on to altmetrics. So citations are very useful to try to assess the impact of science on science. So this doesn't show anything on the clinical advances or societal impact or anything, but there's a demand for such impact of let's say the global impact of science outside the scientific community. And so for that, there's a new set of indicators that have emerged around, I'd say 10 years ago, and which are called altmetrics. So a bit like alternative music in the 1990s, for those of you who are of my generation, altmetrics are a poorly defined category. So it basically groups everything that is not citation-based. So altmetrics basically includes tweets, Facebook posts, Google posts, Wikipedia citations, documents that are saved on Mendeley and Zotero. So it's all of the traces that papers leave online by being shared, by being saved, etc. So it's a very heterogeneous set of indicators, but which are really useful to see how the scientific community reacts, and in some cases, the general public reacts to pieces of research that are being published. And so in order to get that, there's a little tool that is called altmetric.com. And this is what is presented here. And it's actually free when you just download the little bookmarklet on your Google toolbar. And you can get this type of information for each and every paper that has a digital object identifier, which means that it can do that for any paper that is published, let's say over the last 15 to 20 years. So these altmetrics give you again the attention that are given by those papers. There's a lot of data in there and a lot of potential indicators. There's amazing stuff in there, but there's stuff which is not that useful. So all of these traces, let's say on Twitter, that are left by papers, sometimes there's engagement. So sometimes scientists actually discuss the papers online. Sometimes it's just as a dissemination tool. But still, if a paper got disseminated thousands of times on Twitter, well, it's because it adds some kind of importance to those who shared it. And contrary to citations, which takes years to accumulate, tweets can be mined very quickly. Again, social media is something that goes very fast. So on the day a paper is out, if it's going to be tweeted a lot, well, it should appear very, very quickly. The issue, though, is that the meaning of these is a bit unclear. So when altmetric emerged, people thought that this would be an indicator of research of societal impact, the impact on society, that it would be the general public tweeting scholarly paper. In reality, it's not so much the case. There's a bit of general public, but who's going to tweet a paper published in a specialized journal? Well, it's going to be a specialist researcher. So what it shows is, let's say, it shows the visibility in many cases for scientists of a given piece of research. So it is genuine visibility, but it's not so much visibility on society. There is a way to measure the visibility on society, but we need to go through what we call second order events. So you publish your paper in Nature, the Globe and Mail picks it up and writes a paper about it, and then the general public tweets the Globe and Mail article. So you need to actually do that little leap from the scientific paper, the newspaper article, and then looking at the tweets to the newspaper article. So all of that is feasible, but it takes just a little bit more of investment. And then all of these platforms are a bit heterogeneous. So there's tweets, which we understand relatively well, but there's also other types of things that are being mined, which we don't really know. One that is actually very useful from a societal impact point of view is that in all of these altmetrics, the company is able to mine citations in policy documents. And so this is really interesting, I believe, from a, let's say, clinical impact point of view. Of course, the policy documents that are being mined are mostly British and American. There's a couple of Canadian documents. The coverage is improving, but it does have a couple of geographical biases. So in all of these altmetrics, again, what's interesting is that it does not really correlate with citations. So papers that are the most cited are not necessarily the most tweeted. So it does provide a different set of information. And one way to look at that is to also look at what type of documents are the most tweeted. So just as a comparison, look at the bottom, review articles and news items. So of course, review articles are highly cited on average, or much more cited, and very little tweets because they are complex documents that need, let's say, a bit of engagement to be able to tweet them. On the other hand, news items, which are easy to read and easy to understand, are highly tweeted, but they're not that much cited. So it shows that the dynamic of Twitter is different from the dynamic of citations, and that there's, in this case, also a bit of a disciplinary differences. So from a field point of view, papers in psychology that many people can relate with are much highly tweeted than papers in physics that have a very complex title with equations. So there's nothing to really discuss on those papers on social media. So there's inequalities in disciplines. Very quickly, a couple of examples of papers that were quite viral, and that just to show how these indicators behave, and that's a bit funny also, I think. So this was a paper that was really, really tweeted a lot for a very simple reason, is that its abstract was kind of a joke. So title is, can apparent superluminal neutrino speeds be explained as a quantum weak measurement? The abstract is probably not. So of course, that kind of led to scientists laughing about the joke. This one is the best, but it's a bit depressing. So a very serious paper in ecology, so variation in melanism and female preference in proximate but ecologically distinct environments. And then that's in the paper. So instead of citing a given paper, there's a parenthesis that says, should we cite the crappy Gabor paper here? And so that's in the published version. So the authors did not realize they had left that there. The proofreader did not see that, the editor, reviewer. So it was published like that. So of course it got tweeted like crazy. I don't think Gabor felt pretty good about it, to be honest. But so in the end, the author had to issue a correction and they cited the paper at least. I mean, that was the least they could do. So you kind of see the virality. So academics are also laughing sometimes. And so there's a lot of virality, which are kind of inside jokes for academics there. So in other words, to conclude on that metric, there's a lot of good things in there, but there's a lot of papers that are going to be tweeted a lot, but for the wrong reason. So we need to be careful with their use. So I spoke a lot about impact, but impact is not only citations. There's a lot of things which you may want to look at on the effect of the platform, which are not citation based. So you may want to look at production or growth. So there's a new platform that emerges in a given field. So how does the use of that platform affect the growth? So given that we have production indicators, we can look at growth, declines, etc., within specialties and disciplines. You may also want to look at the effect of a platform on structuring the field. So how does it lead to more collaboration? Do you actually see networks that did not exist before? Did it lead to higher international collaboration? There's a lot of research that is done with bibliometric data that is kind of quasi-experimental. So you have two groups in the same field. One uses a platform, the other one doesn't. Well, what do we see in a couple of years after? And this can all be done with those types of indicators. We can also look at indicators of specialization. So are you actually doing more of a research in the field compared to others? And of course, there's many indicators of interdisciplinarity that can be compiled. And those can be compiled both from a, let's say, social point of view. So do you see sociologists or physicists working with chemists? So that's one way that we can assess it. Or you can assess it through the references that appear on the paper. So is that article citing literature from chemistry and physics? So does it integrate the two disciplines? So all of those can be compiled with those bibliometric databases. So a couple of words on adverse effects, and then I'll conclude on the platform. I know that time has flown. There's a lot of indicators. There's a sea of indicators. I just bought a book 2 years ago. That's this dictionary of bibliometric indicator, and it was as thick as the Collins or the Robert or Larousse in French. So it's crazy. There's a lot of indicators, and I believe that this is a bit dangerous because it means that pretty much anyone can find an indicator where they look good or better. We also need to be careful about being transparent about bibliometric indicator. I think transparency is crucial, but we need to be careful not to change the behavior of research. And we know that bibliometric indicators have already changed the behavior. Researchers are publishing more than before. There's a lot of scientific fraud, there's a lot of unethical authorship. So there's a lot of already visible adverse effects of bibliometry. So we really need to be responsible in our use of those indicators. Researchers react to incentives. We need to make sure that we put in the proper incentives when it comes to those indicators. So challenges for platforms, and hopefully we'll have a couple of minutes to discuss. Of course, so I was looking at the website of your organization, looking at the various platforms that are listed as members. It has plenty of different forms. It has plenty of different sizes. And I think there's a challenge there about defining, at least from an external point of view, and I'm no expert on platform, about what it is, what a platform is. And I'm sure you've thought about that, but this is something that leads, I believe, to some challenges in the measurement of the effect of a given platform in a field. From a more technical point of view, and I had a look when I had this project with Laurence and with other colleagues, platforms are often invisible. There's no traces of them on scholarly papers. So institutions are going to be there, funders are going to be there, but the platform itself is not always visible, be it in the institutions, so in the addresses of the author, or in the acknowledgements. So, of course, councils have a similar problem, but I think it's even more problematic for platforms because, again, funders are now requesting it, and there's probably something that this has to be considered by you guys. And of course, there's, in many cases, maybe even the awareness of some researchers that they don't necessarily know that they're part of the platform. But really, the key thing is the attribution. We're able to attribute a piece of research to an institution. We're able to do that for a funder. The platform kind of falls in between, which means that it's very difficult to find such traces on scholarly papers. So very quickly, a couple of to-dos and not to do, and then I'm done. So bibliometric is useful, especially when it's combined with peer review. These indicators have to be taken in their context. You cannot compare a young researcher to an old one, and same with a young and an old platform. Data needs to be clean, and that goes back to the black box. That is the last point in the not to do. You need to understand what's in there. So you need to be able to see records, and you need to be able to clean it, and also to get some expert advice. Not to do, never reduce performance to the single indicator. Some of you have noticed that I did not say anything on the H index. The H index is total crap. You should not use that. It tries to compress everything into one number. That's bad practice. Be careful with composite indicators. So sometimes we want to include too many things and combine everything into a single number. that's a bit dangerous. If those are two different dimensions, keep them separately, because a center may be great on that aspect, but not as good as the other. And I think it needs to be fair to make this comparative assessment. Be careful with cross-disciplinary comparison. And as I said, no blockbusters. You guys are scientists. You should be able to understand what's in there, and these analyses need to be reproducible. So for those of you who are curious, there's two books, one in French, one in English. It's the translation of the other, about the measurement of science. The French one is free online. It's in open access. But if you want to buy it on paper, it's very cheap. I think they're both $10. So voila, I stop here, and thanks for your time.